Game mode with base defense. Never happening.
Hoping for base defense. There will be no base defense in the game at all.
When base defense? Never.
Is there combat and base defense required in the game? No, and that will never happen.
A popular feature request for Satisfactory is base defense or tower defense, essentially some sort of additional purpose for combat in the game. And it does make sense, as there are a variety of enemies, a ton of different types of ammo and explosives you can make, and other factory games like Factorio have enemies that try to take down your operations. So why doesn't Satisfactory have base defense, and why is Coffee Stain Studios so against the concept? Let's explore that in today's video. I'm going to provide some arguments against base defense primarily, but I'm also going to throw the supporters a bone and talk about some ways that the mechanic could be added to the game and what it would take to do so. It's just not in the vision for Satisfactory. Entertainment media like video games and movies can be difficult to discuss because there are two sometimes oppositional prongs involved in creating them. On one hand, a video game is a product. That product has to appeal to a wide enough audience to generate sales in order to make profit for the company that created it. On the other hand, a video game is a work of art that reflects the artistic choices of the team that designed it. Sometimes game design choices are made to attract a wider player base, and sometimes choices are made to correspond with the unique vision of the game creator or the team. And I think, to put it simply, we don't have base defense simply because the developers decided that it doesn't fit within their vision of the game.
That's not the type of game we want Satisfactory to be.
And as a piece of art, the game reflects its creator's desires, and consumers can vote with their dollars. If we don't like it, we don't have to buy it. But we have overwhelmingly voted that base defense is not deterring us from playing the game. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want it, it just means that we don't view it as a critical aspect. The lack of base defense does not take away from the core gameplay. Coffee Stain's previous game, Sanctum, actually does feature base defense mechanics, but I think differentiating Satisfactory from Sanctum is definitely a reason for avoiding the mechanic in this game.
A Satisfactory style tower defense game would be sick. Actually, that kind of exists. Check out Sanctum. If you check out Sanctum 2, yeah, it's kind of the same thing, just no factory.
Related to these points is something that Coffee Stain has actually brought up before in videos, which is essentially that every game has to have limitations and you have to decide what your game is and what your game isn't. It just can't have every single feature, even if those features are good. There has to be an end to development. The plain truth is that Satisfactory just isn't the type of game that wants to have base defense. And it's so far along in development anyways that it would involve a complete redesign and rebalancing of the game for it to feel like it belongs, which I'll get into later. And I know there will be comments arguing against this point and that it's as simple as just adding base defense. But I guarantee you it's not that easy, and it would fundamentally change what the game is. And the game is currently a mostly chill factory building game, whereas Factorio has a different goal in mind with its base defense. Despite their similarities, Factorio and Satisfactory are different games and have completely different objectives despite both being factory games. Some players may argue that base defense could make the game better, but what it would undoubtedly do is make the game different. And different is not what the developers want, or most players for that matter. But okay, that's a bit of a philosophical reason why Satisfactory doesn't have base defense, but let's look at some more technical and gameplay reasons now. It would ruin the flow of the game. Adding base defense in a meaningful way would mean inevitably changing the basic nature of the gameplay in a way that would no longer make it feel like the Satisfactory we know and love. The nice thing about Satisfactory is that as long as your power system is good to go, you can kind of just spend hours working on making a factory look nice, and you don't have to worry about anything getting in the way. The hard part about survival games with building mechanics is that you often can't afford to waste time making things look nice or more functional, because night falls and you have to sleep, or your hunger bar gets too low, or enemies spawn and try to attack you. While this is to be expected in a survival game, it's kind of the name of the game, Satisfactory's survival mechanics extend about as far as being able to eat food to heal yourself. It's not explicitly a survival game, and it doesn't try to be, and the rest of the game is built around that fact. You can really get in the flow of Satisfactory and not be interrupted, and features have been added to the game specifically to reinforce this. For example, the Dimensional Depot exists almost entirely to reduce the amount of times the flow of gameplay is interrupted, by offering a way to continuously supply the player with materials while working on a project. You basically don't have to run back and forth to your base while working on something. You can just go with the flow. I don't think the developers are interested in adding any features that disrupt that flow, and they would only add something that made the flow even more smooth. Base defense just goes completely against the design goals of this game. In fact, one of the goals of the game is to make the player feel that they are imposing themselves upon the world, not the other way around. Base defense is completely counter to that overarching goal. I think a valid argument against this point is that it should just be optional. Like most other aspects of the game, you can already tweak settings until you're essentially playing in creative mode, so toggling off base defense can just be part of that. In fact, base defense could even be off by default and only be turned on if you decide to play with some kind of hardcore mode. Also, you can currently change the hostility level of creatures between passive, retaliatory, and hostile. A fourth option could be added that allows the creatures to attack you or your base. I think there's a middle ground here that would allow for some basic base defense that can be turned on as an option. However, I also don't think that the devs want to half-ass something like that. And a solution like that would have to be half-assed instead of full-assed because gameplay would need to be redesigned. There are a lot of gameplay changes that would need to happen to make base defense a worthy mechanic and actually have it be enjoyable. Systems would need to be added to damage structures, determine what happens when certain damage amounts are reached, determine how repairs work, a graphical representation of the damage and where it is, what triggers an attack in the first place, how the player is warned of an attack, if at all, and so on. It would require input from developers, UI designers, art designers, sound designers, and the overview of the game director. At the minimum, I'm sure I'm missing plenty of roles that would be involved in a project like this. Basically, I'm saying that it would take a ton of work. And now that, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. Something that requires all that work could definitely be worthy of a DLC. But it's different enough compared to other features of the game that I imagine that programming it would involve starting almost from scratch, at least to a certain extent for certain aspects of it. But the biggest concern for me personally is actually how gameplay would change as a result of base defense. I think that gameplay would be warped around base defense if it was actually a significant mechanic. In the mid to late game, your factories are spread out across the entire map, and it's a pretty big map. Even with proper infrastructure, getting from one location to another can be difficult and/or take a long time. If a hostile attack can happen anywhere at any time, you may be out of luck when an outpost on the opposite side of the map comes under attack. I'm even imagining a more terrifying scenario where a random power tower in the middle of nowhere that connects your factories gets attacked and destroyed, and you lose power to critical systems, as well as the train or the hypertube that was going to get you back home. Base defense works in Factorio because of the top-down perspective and the ability to move the camera all around the map in an instant. Satisfactory simply doesn't work that way. The map is too large and the perspective is different. You'd also need a system for when the creatures attack. It could be like Factorio, where the more pollution or maybe noise the player makes, the more waves of enemies come at you. Or it could be like Minecraft, where the enemies only attack bases at night. A sleep mechanic could be added to mitigate this, but then the game really starts to become more of a survival game than a factory game, and that would interrupt the flow and the goals of the game. Now, there are a few ways to implement base defense in a way that mitigates these issues. One solution is that the radar towers could gain an additional feature that warns you in advance about incoming attacks and starts a countdown, giving you time to come back while also giving more usefulness to the radar tower. Or attacks may only be able to occur within a certain radius of the player's location, so that you never have to travel far. I've played games that utilize both of these methods, and they work. Another solution is that only production buildings are targeted and power infrastructure is left alone, which could maybe work logically, since hostile creatures would naturally be attracted to the machines making the most noise. Basically, it doesn't have to go deep into realism to still be effective. Creatures would need to be redesigned. Creatures would also need to be fundamentally changed. Despite them looking like animals, hostile creatures in Satisfactory currently serve the same gameplay function as static hazards like gas pillars and uranium outcroppings. They exist as a challenge to accessing a convenient natural road or a valuable resource, and most of the time they can all be easily avoided with high explosives or heavy weapons. Also, creatures are currently repulsed by production machines, meaning they won't spawn if you build a factory near their normal spawn point. All of this would need to be totally reversed, causing creatures to actively spawn near production machines or be attracted to them. This would change their functionality from guardians of desirable areas to an active threat that seeks you out. If they leave their designated areas, this may undermine the vision for their use in the game. They'll still be serving as an obstacle, but it will be a functionally different kind of obstacle. Creature spawns would also have to be considered. Currently, they somewhat scale with the region and how valuable a resource is, though I'm not sure what the overall logic is. There are two ways to approach this in a base defense situation. The first is that creature spawn areas are unchanged and early game players will simply be punished for going into areas designed for the late game by being attacked by enemies like nuclear hogs or poison stingers. The other option is that creature spawns can scale with the hub tier, so that no matter where you choose to start your game, you only have to deal with basic hogs at first, and gradually face harder enemies as you progress through the game. However, these methods bring up further questions about how normal creature spawns are handled while exploring versus base building. It also requires just an overall analysis of the game and a whole bunch of balancing. It introduces pointless tedium. There are plenty of things in Satisfactory that are tedious, especially when you're working on some large-scale builds. But that tedium is kind of the point. You get in the flow, like I mentioned earlier, and you just build and design for hours on end. But a base defense mechanic would create tedium just for the sake of tedium. After building a factory, it would get attacked, and then you would have to go rebuild it or repair it. Either way, you would need to go over things you've already worked on. It'd be about as enjoyable as building with the wrong material and then hand painting everything with the desired one. Most things in Satisfactory work toward a greater goal or to solve a puzzle. Rebuilding and repairing does not really solve a puzzle. However, base defense in general would be a puzzle of its own, so that is a point in its favor. Players would need to arrange their defenses in a way that protects their factories well, and possibly adjust them to tackle different types of enemies. It would push players to research new ammo and new nobelisks to tackle the threats. That aspect is not incompatible with the goals of the game as they stand. But the real problem comes with what happens when you fail to properly defend yourself. Something like a blown power grid is a setback, but it can be overcome by turning off non-essential factories and expanding your power production, which is something that has to be done in the game regardless. This problem scales the larger your factory is, and a reasonably sized factory that gets damaged would cause a fair number of players to simply rage quit because it's too overwhelming. Either way, it would be a massive roadblock in an otherwise satisfying game where you only progress and never regress. In short, base defense would add regression to Satisfactory, which for the most part is just not a concept that exists in the game. I know I personally get frustrated in other games when all my hard work is undone by something like this. To a certain extent, gamers can and should learn through failure and adapt to a new situation, rather than just being handheld the whole way. Failing a boss fight, then learning the right methods and coming back to beat it is really satisfying. There's a reason why games like Elden Ring are so popular. But there is a limit to this, and especially for players that like to build large and complex factories, base defense becomes another frustrating barrier, which circles back to my argument about the flow of the game, but also to the point in favor of base defense about simply being able to toggle it off. A certain type of player might like this challenge and enjoy that failure sets them back, but I think ultimately the player should have a choice in the matter. Satisfactory has proven time and time again that it is not set in stone, even adding features that were promised would never exist. However, most of the features that have been added support its overall goals rather than adding new ones. Base defense fundamentally changes what the game is about and would warp the gameplay around it. It adds a distraction from the main points of the game. While some players would undoubtedly enjoy it, many players choose Satisfactory over games like Factorio because it is so chill, even without turning on some of the creative mode cheats or turning off creature hostility. Base defense would add unnecessary conflict to the game that goes against those chill aspects and would require a lot of new systems that aren't at all related to the ones that are already in the game. At this point, where 1.0 and 1.1 have already come out, it's not realistic to disrupt the current loop of the game and essentially redesign it from the ground up. But there will still be people who argue for it, and I get it. And who knows, maybe we'll get a Satisfactory Sanctum DLC that adds base defense mechanics. Or maybe there will be an ambitious mod that sets out to add it. Despite obviously not thinking that is a good idea, I really do hope that the base defense enjoyers are able to experience this type of gameplay somehow. Satisfactory has a lot of combat and a lot of ammo and explosives, and it can feel like it's being wasted. I'm definitely not saying that base defense wouldn't be fun, but I do want to stress that it's a little more difficult than some people think it is. Since this is such a hot topic for some players, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you feel about base defense? Are you for it or against it? Do my arguments against base defense make sense, or do you think I'm giving these roadblocks a bit too much credit? Let me know your thoughts, and if you want more hot takes, check out this video where I tell you why you don't want precise splitters in Satisfactory.
Also, this base looks like it's preparing for tower defense. We're not going to add tower defense, you guys. But really nice regardless, tricky.